All right, diving right in to another deep dive with us today.
Yeah.
This one, well, it's a big one, really. It's a foundational topic for anyone interested in international relations,
Yeah.
but especially for those prepping for the UPSC.
Oh, absolutely.
But even if you're not, exam bound or anything, this topic is something that everyone should think about,
Right.
because it really gets at how our world works, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about the interplay between individualism and community in a globalized age, no less.
Yeah, it's fascinating, because it forces us to really examine these assumptions that we often just take for granted.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what really shapes a society? Is it just every person out for themselves, or is there something more to it?
Yeah, exactly. And the text we're looking at today really digs deep into that question.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, right?
Mhm.
Like, has the world always been so me-focused, with all this emphasis on personal brands and self-improvement and all that?
Well, not at all. What's interesting is, like, our source material here, it paints this picture of these traditional societies
Okay.
where the individual, wasn't even really the main unit of thought.
Wow.
It was all about the group you belong to, your family, your village, your tribe. That's what mattered.
So, like, your whole life was pretty much laid out for you
Yeah.
based on where you were born.
Exactly.
Not a lot of room for switching careers or moving to a new city or anything like that.
Right, exactly. Change happened slowly, generation after generation, people doing similar work, holding the same beliefs. Really, the individual's purpose was tied to that community survival, the well-being of the whole group.
Okay, so that was like the traditional model.
Mm-hmm.
So how did we get from there to where we are now?
Oh.
Where, at least in some parts of the world, individualism seems to be king.
Well, the text points to this major turning point, the rise of industrial capitalism, which, it brought about massive changes, right? Huge urbanization, new technologies, and it completely changed the way people work and live.
Yeah, so instead of everyone like farming or doing crafts, you had factories and specialized jobs and people moving to cities for opportunities.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, especially from a sociological perspective,
Okay.
because thinkers like Tenney's and Durkheim, they were actually observing all these shifts as they were happening. And they had some pretty strong opinions about, how it was impacting society.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What were their concerns?
Well, Tönnies, for example, he talked about this shift from Gemeinschaft, which is that traditional community, right, based on shared values, close relationships, to Gesellschaft, which is, well, it's more impersonal, driven by economic interests.
Okay.
So he saw this as a loss of something really fundamental.
So like instead of everyone knowing their neighbors and helping each other out, it becomes more about transactions and individual gain.
Yeah, that's the idea. And then Durkheim, he was worried about this thing called anomie. It's this feeling of, normlessness or disconnect
Right.
that can happen when those traditional social structures break down. And he even went so far as to link it to rising suicide rates,
Wow.
suggesting, that people really need those strong community ties for their well-being.
So they were seeing this rise of individualism not just as a change in how people live, but as something potentially really damaging to like the fabric of society.
Exactly. But it's not a simple black and white situation, you
Right.
know? The text also acknowledges, there were some positive sides to this shift towards individualism as well.
Like what specifically?
Well, think about it, the emphasis on individual rights and freedoms, that was crucial for all sorts of movements, like the fight for civil rights, women's suffrage, LGBTQ plus equality. All of these movements were rooted in this idea that each person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their group affiliations.
That's a really good point. So it's kind of like this double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have the potential for, isolation and the erosion of community bonds. But on the other hand, you have these huge strides in terms of individual liberty and social progress.
Exactly. And for, UPSC aspirants especially, this tension, this tug of war between individual and collective needs,
Right.
you see it playing out on the world stage all the time. It's like how nations balance these competing demands. It's a huge factor in international relations.
So understanding this historical context, this kind of tug of war between the individual and the group, that's crucial for anyone who wants to really analyze global politics.
Absolutely. It helps you make sense of why different cultures might have such different approaches to things, like human rights, economic development, even environmental policies. It's all connected. It all comes down to values in the end, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of different approaches, our source material, it it goes on to explore this really interesting question
Okay.
about whether individualism, is it like inherently linked to consumerism?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because I've definitely wondered about that myself. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're just constantly bombarded with all these messages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Telling us to buy more, upgrade our stuff, keep up with the latest trends. It's almost like happiness itself is being marketed to us
Yeah.
as something you can just like purchase.
Right. And the text really pushes back against that. It presents this idea that consumerism could actually be a form of captivity.
Captivity. That's a pretty strong word.
Mm-hmm.
What do they mean by that?
Well, just think about it for a second. If you're always striving for that next gadget, the bigger house, the newest fashion, like, are you ever really satisfied?
Right?
Or are you always just chasing after something that's, just out of reach?
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. It's like maybe we're not really making these free choices, but we're being kind of like manipulated by these marketing forces that just want to keep us wanting more, you know?
Exactly, exactly. And there's a whole field of study called happiness economics that actually looks into this.
Yeah.
You'd think that, like, in wealthier societies where people have access to all this stuff, they'd be happier, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the message we're sold for sure.
But what the research shows is, like, beyond a certain point, more wealth doesn't really equal more happiness.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, some studies even suggest that once you've got your basic needs met, focusing too much on material possessions, well, it can actually make you less happy.
That's a pretty surprising fact. It
Hmm.
really makes you question this whole like consumerist model.
It does. And the text even highlights some, like, specific studies, challenging these assumptions.
Yeah.
There was one, I think, where they found that people who prioritize experiences over material possessions, they actually reported, higher levels of happiness, more life satisfaction.
So instead of like buying that new TV, maybe you're better off like taking a trip or learning a new skill.
Exactly. And there's this other study, fascinating. They found that people who spend money on others, whether through charitable giving or even just buying gifts for loved ones, they experience a bigger boost in happiness than people who spend money on themselves.
Wow, that's incredible. So not only does consumerism not necessarily lead to like lasting happiness,
Hmm.
but it might actually be like stopping us from finding those deeper sources of fulfillment,
Yeah.
the ones that come from, connection and generosity and stuff like that.
Precisely. And for those of you prepping for the UPSC, this link between individualism and consumerism, it's definitely something to keep in mind. When you're analyzing international relations, it's not just an economic or social issue, it has huge political implications.
How so?
Well, think about, like, the global power dynamics. Often the countries that push for free markets, globalization, those are also the countries where consumerism is most widespread, right?
Right.
And this can create tension with cultures that prioritize different values, like community, sustainability, or even spiritual well-being.
So it's like this clash of ideologies playing out on the world stage.
Exactly. And understanding those, like, underlying values, it's crucial for navigating all those complex relationships, coming up with solutions that actually work for everyone.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I feel like we're really starting to connect some dots here. So we've talked about, the rise of individualism, the potential downsides, the links to consumerism.
Yeah.
But where does globalization actually fit into all of this?
That's the next piece of the puzzle. And one of the big questions the text explores is, does globalization inevitably lead to a world where everyone becomes an individualist, like embracing Western values and abandoning their own traditions?
So it's not necessarily like a one-way street
Hmm.
where everyone just ends up thinking and acting the same.
Exactly, yeah. It's way more complicated than that. In fact, what the text argues. It says that globalization can actually trigger, like, a backlash
Okay.
where people kind of double down on their cultural or religious identities. Almost like a response, right, to this perceived threat of, homogenization.
So instead of everyone becoming like more individualistic, some people might actually become even more rooted in their traditions.
Exactly, exactly. And this is something, UPSC aspirants especially, they should really pay attention to this
Okay.
because it has massive implications for international relations. You see it playing out all over, right? The rise of these nationalist movements, religious revivals, all sorts of things. It's like this constant push and pull between the global and the local, the individual and the collective.
Wow. This is giving me a lot to think about. So to kind of like wrap up this deep dive, what would you say is the key takeaway from all of this? What do we want our listeners to to walk away with, especially those, getting ready for the UPSC exams?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers. When it comes to this whole interplay between individual and community,
Yeah.
especially in our globalized world, right? It's this constant balancing act. And it's something that each society, each culture, they have to figure out their own way of dealing with it.
And for those studying international relations, understanding these nuances, that's crucial, right, for analyzing global trends and kind of predicting how different nations might interact on the world stage.
Absolutely, yeah. You can't just look at like economic indicators or military strength. You have to go deeper, you know? Understand the cultural and sociological stuff that's really driving these decisions. Like, why is one country pushing for individual liberty while another is prioritizing social harmony? These questions, they're all rooted in this very tension that we've been talking about.
You've given us so much to consider today. Before we sign off, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The source material, it ends by asking this really thought-provoking question about, as the world becomes increasingly interconnected, what is the future of community? Will we find new ways to balance individual freedom with that sense of belonging? Or are we headed towards, like, an increasingly fragmented world?
That's a big question. It's one that we all have to wrestle with, not just in our own lives, but on that global scale. And I don't think there's a single, like, right answer.
Mm.
But I think by understanding the historical context, the different perspectives, all the forces at play, we can at least start having those really important conversations.
Yeah.
And hopefully, work towards a future where both the individual and the community can thrive.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more explorations of these fascinating topics. It'll not only help you understand the world better, but also, ace those UPSC exams. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.